Hello, and I think we're on. So we've all had our technical training here on the call. We've had hours and hours of technical training, haven't we, people? And we've had it drummed into us what we must and must not do. My name's Charlie Dobres. I'm the moderator for this particular call, which means if I speak too much, it won't just be a usual case of a man speaking too much, it'll be a moderator speaking too much. So apologies, and hopefully that won't happen. This particular session is called Brand Innovation and Purpose, where women's football beats men's football. So we've already had a session, I think, today about sponsorship, and this session wants to look in a slightly different couple of different ways about specifics, possibly about women's football. But before we get into it, I'm just going to introduce everybody, and they have no idea what I'm going to say. They supplied me stuff beforehand, but in fact, I've just used random series of words to describe them. So let's see how we go. So first of all, we have Gill Whitty-Collins. Gill, you can probably smile in a Brady Bunch way and wave or something. Thank you.
Hello, everybody.
Now, I know this is true, you want to deny the following statement about you, but Gill spent 26 years with Procter & Gamble, ultimately as a vice president, running global brands such as Olay, Clairol, Always, Tampax and Pantene. And apparently it was after studying modern and medieval languages at Cambridge University that Gill joined P&G's marketing department, not an obvious step, and quickly progressed through the ranks. She swiftly moved from marketing director to general manager, and finally to vice president. But this was when she started to see the impact of gender diversity on women and their careers, and she's now put all her experience and knowledge into a rather marvelous book which has just been published called Why Men Win at Work. Shameless plug there. Jill, I haven't quite finished it, but I'm hopefully can quote some things out of it to impress you. So that's Jill, thank you. Karen Dobres, who incredibly shares the same surname as me, lives in the is an elected director at Lewes Football Club, which is where I'm also at. And Karen was not a follower of football at all until local club Lewes became the first club in the world in 2017 to allocate equal resources and playing budgets and marketing and everything to the women's and men's teams. And that was 3 years ago. And at that point, I think it's fair to say, or she tells me, that she saw an opportunity to help make the world a little less sexist through using football. And just so you know, the club's women's team play in the FA Women's Championship, which is one league below the Super League. And last but not least, hi to Katie Scallan, who's there in Houston, Texas. Excellent. I should explain that I'm in Lewes, so's Karen. Jill's in Geneva, yeah, and Kate is in Houston. So it's a truly all you need is love global moment going on at the moment. Katie is the Chief Marketing Officer for Houston Dynamo and Dash, and has been for just over a year, which means that, Katie, if I'm correct, you oversee, and this is quite a long list, the branding, marketing, advertising communications, community relations, in-game experience, and broadcast efforts for both the Houston Dynamo, who play in the men's MLS, and Dash, who play in the National Women's Soccer League, as well as events at the BBVA Stadium where you are. So that's a long list. And prior to this, I think you also spent 14 years or so at Toyota in marketing as well. Is that correct? Is everybody happy with the introduction so far?
Perfect.
That's good. No one's left the call, so we're doing well. So what I wanted to do, I wanted to look at a couple of different ways of looking at sponsorship as it is. And one way is to look at what I've called the external versus internal. I think it's fair to say that sponsoring men's football has proved an effective way to target customers for many brands over the last few decades. I'm sure we can all think of some. And it's a marketing spend. It's out of a marketing department spend. And I'm thinking that given the kind of the socio-political nature of women playing football, do you see other ways that companies might partner with and leverage women's football? So I'm thinking more here of staff messaging, investor messaging, recruiting the best female candidates because of your backing for women's football as well. So I guess it's a matter of, is women's football something that a company's CSR and human resources people should be looking at investing in, not just the marketing department? I'm going to start with Jill on this one, Jill. So that's the general sort of thing. Thinking about your experience and what you've written in your book, Just to kind of think about that question, and also the connection between team sport participation and women in leadership roles, as to why companies might want to be particularly interested in women's football.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question, and if I was running a company right now, I'd absolutely be interested in. I'd be interested in this externally as well, which I know we're going to come on to talk about from a brand point of view. But internally, absolutely, and I think on two major fronts. I think firstly, it's unequivocal that seeing women play football, seeing women play sport is an extremely empowering thing for women, and to see women doing. It's so important to see women in this way, and to see them, in this way, rather than the way that we frankly too often see women. So I think that when a company invests in this and says, I want to partner with this club, or with women's football, they make a massive statement to their own employees about the way they see women. I think a company that does this is saying, I see women this way. I don't see women in a negative way. And I think that's a fantastic message to send to the people who work for you. And I think on the other front, we know that when the girls and ultimately women who play sport, they develop absolutely phenomenal skills that are useful to them way beyond sports. Team building skills, resilience, leadership skills. So any company who wants to recruit absolutely phenomenal women who may leave sport one day and want to go into more of a management leadership kind of role, if that company's been present in that girl's consciousness from the start, and in the consciousness of the people watching that sport, they are going to show up very, very well when those girls and women ultimately are making their choice about what kind of company they want to join. So I think it's a phenomenal internal opportunity. And to your question, absolutely, then this has to go beyond something that just the marketing department and the brands are looking at. This really should be something that the HR and the internal people focused functions are really, really thinking about. I was absolutely doing it if I were them.
That's really interesting. I mean, Katie, just coming to you. I mean, you're in a fantastic position, and you've been there for a year now, where you're Chief Marketing Officer for the men's team and the women's team. And I know we've talked before this about how you really try and market the two together, but I guess you must also find some differences. So I'm thinking about, I think it's good to say that Dash is the only professional women's sports team in Houston, for example. So do you find that there are still differences you're putting across? Do you still find you're talking predominantly to marketing budget people? Are you having any conversations beyond that in CSR, etc.? What's your experience?
Yeah, it's a great question, because it is working. That is happening for us in the fact that the Dash, being the only women's professional sports team in Houston, and there's only two in the great state of Texas, which is one of the largest states in the United States. So it is a big deal for us. And Houston being the fourth largest city in America, and also the most diverse city, it really has enabled us, because we are also the energy capital of the world. All the oil and gas is headquartered here in Houston. And a lot of those companies are approaching us at the Dash for the recruitment efforts, because women typically don't fill the science and engineering roles as much at the energy companies. And so this is a way on the HR side and the corporate social responsibility side that they get to, participate in aligning themselves with a professional women's sports team, and therefore elevating their, profile in the market.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Karen, I know that, obviously, many reasons, I know that you've given seminars to many groups of women yourself on the experience of introducing gender equality at Lewes Football Club. Is that something that might translate into the corporate world as kind of part of the sell that they might get? Apologies, by the way, if you can hear the sound of could be typing. I'm not quite sure what it is. It might be someone's released 30 mice and they're running across the keyboard somewhere. So if you hear typing, we're trying to do something about it. So sorry, Karen, the question to you was about taking the work that you do in talking about the football club's work in gender equality, and whether you think any of the things you say in that might translate into CSR departments and usefully internal companies that might want to sponsor.
Well, the short answer is yes, definitely, because there's such a sense of optimism about the talks that I do, and the audiences that listen to them, who are largely what I call unwelcome women who aren't into football and are unengaged with football. I talk to them about Lewes Football Club equality campaign and how it's the first club in the world to split the revenues equally between the men and women. And I tell them about the gender disparities in football in terms of the prize fund or pay or treatment, and the way that women and men are valued unequally. And they really want to take action, and they get very fired up. And I think in some ways, football being so male dominated and the way that men's football is valued so much more than women's is so normalised in football, I think football can be a microcosm for the wider patriarchal society that we live in. So if anyone has got issues about gender inequality in their workforce, and I think quite a few people could put their hands up to that, then I think the story of Equality FC and how Lewes Football Club became aware of the inequalities enough to take radical, bold action about them, and then dealt with some of the backlash that came from that decision. People saying, you know, women's football's not worth it, they don't get the same crowd. And what we did about that, the actions that we then took to prove that the crowd would come if you put the marketing behind them. In fact, we quadrupled our crowd figure for the Women's Gate in 2 seasons. And then educating people about why the situation is as it is. There's not something inherent about women's football that makes it less entertaining than men's. It's the way the playing field is completely unlevel in historical terms. I think the story is inspiring, and it shows a commitment to justice, equality, and all of these wonderful things that we need, because diversity in any company, I think, makes for innovation and creativity. And we've certainly, you know, been quite creative about our women's matches and the way we've marketed at Lewes FC. So yeah, we've got the long answer is yes. It's a great story to translate.
I suppose I'm kind of thinking here, this is a question I'll ask you as well. I mean, it seems to be increasing companies talking about social purpose for their brands, and very big companies talking about social purpose, starting to incorporate social purpose in their TV ads and stuff like that for employees and brands. And I'm just wondering, I'll go with Katie first this time. It's a bit harsh, but do you think they mean it? I mean, in the US, are you seeing much evidence of this in terms of what you're hearing big brands saying? And are they following through in terms of who they're sponsoring and what they're sponsoring?
Yeah, I think in the US, it is happening. It's likely maybe a little slower than elsewhere in the world, but I also believe brands that are really doing it, they really want to be authentic and not just saying they're doing something. So as it pertains to women's issues, you know, what we're seeing obviously is the empowerment of women, equality, and the inspiration that a woman athlete kind of provides to that community. And in all candor and full transparency, it obviously is less of an investment for a sponsor on the women's side versus men's, because, you know, as we're managing both leagues and both teams, you know, some sponsors are, you know, more willing to, you know, give the Dash a shot before they are the Dynamo because it's a better buy. But in general, folks that are coming to us are, they really are trying to work within that, the empowerment of women and the inspiration they serve. And so it is happening. It is relatively new, and it's probably, like I said, a little slower than the elsewhere in the world. But where I find inspiration personally is that the partners are wanting to be very authentic in their efforts. It's not just, I want to spray and pray and put something up there to look like I'm for women. They really do care. And so I think that is meaningful.
And Gill, I mean, you're going to have quite, again, a useful, unique view on this. And your time inside P&G, do you think this idea of social purpose is real, hopefully, but it's something that's here to stay? Do you think it's something, therefore, that women's football and clubs looking for sponsors should be talking about, or do you think it's just kind of a fad? That was a question to Gill. I beg your pardon. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. I was just waiting. I didn't know whether it was to Karen or to me. I think they absolutely have to mean it, and it absolutely has to be here to stay. I think more and more now, it's extremely important to employees, most employees, particularly women, by the way, that there is some sense of purpose and moral direction in the job that they do to make it worth doing. And the younger generation, I mean, they expect this. They are much less motivated by the things that the older generation were motivated by. They're not just motivated by
I think we may have temporarily Gill there.
Yeah, I still got you. Yeah.
Okay.
Younger generation extremely motivated by a sense of purpose. So I think companies have to mean it. But what I would say is, ultimately companies are commercial, right? They're not angels. They do things for commercial reasons. They do things for profit. So they're not going to do anything. They're not going to invest in anything that they don't ultimately look at and see returns for. And frankly, if they do, it's going to be the first thing that gets cut when things get tough. But what I would say is we know, from all of the data, there's stacks of unequivocal data that driving equality and diversity, driving gender equality and diversity is extremely good for business results. So a company that can drive that internally and really get that equality right up to the senior levels, that is absolutely brilliant for results. So you know what, even if they don't mean it for the right reasons, ultimately they would be stupid not to do it for commercial reasons.
And if I layered onto that, I would say when Gill mentioned the younger demographic is key, because in marketing, we're always trying to skew younger. Day in and day out, any business is always going to keep trying to skew younger. So staying relevant to that demographic is always going to be important for a brand. And, as Gill mentioned, this is the key issue for them. Social justice and purpose and the like are very important moving forward.
Okay, that's good. I mean, I suppose, it would be hard to it's got in terms of will it affect spending if the marketing budget went through different budgets, because I'm sure that many people's experience is that one gets understandably fixated with trying to attract marketing budgets in from brands, but of course there are other significant budgets as well, such as CSR and such like. And Karen, just on the point, I mean, I'm just interested. Obviously, I somewhat know the answer to this question as well. Wondering how Lewes Football Club has actually changed internally as an organisation since equalising its resources between men's and women's teams, in that sense, offering an example about what it does to a company when you back when men's teams. Apologies to everybody for this noise. We have a person trying to find out what it is. We don't know what it is, but bear with us. So, Karen, it's just a question about how it affects a company internally when a football club in this case, commits to gender equality so publicly.
Okay. Yeah, okay, I think I heard you. when Lewes Football Club committed to gender equality internally, how did it affect us internally? Okay, so Yeah, well, basically, wow, a lot of changes have taken place since the introduction of the equality campaign back in July 2017. A lot of it is about conversations and dialogue with people who, mainly, I think, male people, who may not have had gender equality front of mind before. So what we've got in football is a kind of easy road into men's hearts and minds, if you like. And it's brilliant to have these conversations with men. So Lewes Football Club, for anyone listening that doesn't know, is 100% community owned, actually. And we have almost 1,600 owners in 32 countries around the world. And what we noticed as well was that our ownership revenue went up when we introduced gender equality. So there were people around the world who would probably never get to a football match at Lewes FC at the booking time, but they were becoming owners because they agreed with our stance, a groundbreaking stance, because it's a bit sad that we're the first and only club in the world when we introduced it to have equality. But there you go, that says something about football. But they were becoming owners of our club, which you can do, by the way, for just £40 a year. They were becoming owners because they agreed with that stance, and they did it in solidarity with what the message that Lewes Football Club was sending out, which was wonderful. So one thing we had was many more owners and supporters. Another thing that happened internally was that we had to start dealing with a lot more media attention. We're a relatively small club, although our women play in the Championship, which is the second highest tier of English women's football. We're still a relatively small club. So there was a lot of work to do to respond to all the press attention. We were on national TV, we still are. Whenever something comes up about gender equality in sport, we're asked to comment on articles and come on the TV and things like that. So we had a lot more attention. Also, sponsors, we set up an Equality Supporters Club, and we got more sponsors because of the message, the unique message that we were sending out. Also, what we found that was quite strange in a way was that some of our female players who we spoke to about their stories, because one thing that happens when you get media attention is that you need players who can tell their stories, the obstacles they've overcome in order to play football, which every female footballer has. As we asked them about their stories and explained about the fact that we were splitting the revenue equally between the men's and women's teams, they almost became accidentally radicalised, because for so long they'd accepted that they were second best, and that they, in their footballing careers, they'd had sort of crumbs from the men's table. And the difference between that and what we were doing and the efforts that we were making made them feel angry, pleased that we were doing it, but also angry. And they wanted to tell their story. They wanted to talk about the obstacles they'd overcome and how it wasn't actually fair. So that was amazing. And then also what else happened was that in the conversations that we had, there were people who, at the time that we introduced the equality campaign, were saying, what's the point of that? I wouldn't bother watching the ladies play. Boring. I'd much rather watch the county boys play than go to a ladies match. And but a few months later, these same people were coming along to watch the women and going, actually, they're quite good. They're quite technical. This is really an entertaining game of football. So that was great as well. And then the other thing that happened was we had to think very carefully about our marketing for the women's matches, and we had to target women, because we thought that our unique selling point here was equality. And if we got women who understood what football was normally like to come to our women's matches, then we would up our gate figure, which indeed we did. So what we did, we used inspirational women on our posters that weren't necessarily to do with football, but were to do with other aspects of culture that might draw women in different ways, like historical figures, or pop music, or poets, or scientists that were women. And we also introduced things like Prosecco on tap at our women's matches. And that actually went down very well with the men as it goes, because we did Prosecco and the cake.
I like Prosecco as well. I mean, yeah, I'm a big fan of Prosecco as well, to be honest with you. I mean, I just want to, Karen, I'm just going to pick up something that you've mentioned here as well, is about kind of about aspects about women's football that might be different. And I want to ask about one aspect which might be a bit controversial, and whether this is something which is not attractive to sponsors. And Gill, it's something, it's a thing I spotted in not yet finishing, but starting to read your book, Anger. Real sense of being pissed off about women's place at work and how things are unfair and all the rest of it. And I think it's probably fair to say that in women's football, where football has been banned in different countries around the world, in England and France and Brazil and Germany, all these places found it in the early last century, is that whether you think there's any place or interest for Katie and Gill, for like potential sponsors and marketers, to tap into something which is unique about women's football, which is the fact of just being able to play it is amazing, and the fact that you're not allowed to play it for so long, and various other aspects which can cause a lot of passion and almost anger within women's football that isn't there in men's football. Is this a thing that is like potentially attractive to advertisers, or something which is just a bit happy, shiny, and jumping up and down? Can we use that aspect of women's football? I'm going to start with Gill first. I don't know if the question got through because there's a crackle on the line. Thank you. I can come to you because I'm getting. I don't know. Katie, can you hear me with the question?
I don't know if it's just me, but I can't hear. I can hear you speaking. I can't hear what you're saying. So I don't know if it's a question for me. I don't know. I don't know if Katie and Karen are having the same trouble.
Yeah, I am too, unfortunately, but I think I know where you were going. So as it pertains to in my situation, because we have men's and women's here in, and I'm responsible and charged with managing them both. You know, previously the men's team and women's teams were marketed in silos, and so it was very difficult to really garner attention that the women deserved, because they were always an afterthought. And that's pure bandwidth of personnel and budgets and the like. So one of the things that we have stressed importance on in the last year and a half is really coupling them, the men and the women, together as far as branding and promotional efforts. So instead of feeling like the women should be marketed in some different way, we are putting them on the same platform as the men. So, you know, previously in the United States, a lot of women's football, or soccer as we call it, would be marketed towards the suburban housewife with a little girl with, you know, bows in her hair. And now we're really marketing the women as true athletes, the grit, the determination, the same thing that the men go through.
Yes.
So I think branding is very important. And the advertising we do now is we are putting them both on a level playing field, because frankly, they deserve it and they've earned it. And, you know, I think in the United States, we're seeing obviously with the success we had in the last Women's World Cup, that women are, you know, actually women's soccer in America is starting to like surpass men's in some ways, you know, internationally in our performance. So anyways, it's an interesting time for women's football, and really excited that we as an organization here have decided to put the same priority on the women's team as we have in the men's team, which traditionally hasn't always been the case. And as it pertains to the sponsors, really trying to, you know, help educate them on the various opportunities that exist for both clubs, you know, both teams within our one club. And so maybe having crossovers between sponsors, Folks that have only thought about sponsoring men before are now considering sponsoring the women's team. And then also you layer in that social purpose. It's just another tool in the toolbox, as we say.
Okay.
And I think that's really helping here.
So there, and hopefully you can each hear me again now. So this idea of the additional layer of social purpose potentially within women's football is something which could be of interest. I mean, I don't know how much we're yet seeing it from potential marketers. Certainly when I look at the landscape of companies involved in women's football, and we're grateful for the pioneers so far, it seems relatively similar usage of women's football to men's football. I guess in my second and final kind of section, I think we've lost the crackle now, which is great. This is a little subsection I've just called selling soap versus selling hope. When I'm thinking about women's football, it's kind of on the premise that men's football is traditionally used as a vehicle for brands, to buy endorsement and reach, to ultimately sell more products in the short and medium term. But a question for each of you is whether women's football can also be used by brands to actually promote social change to customers, and will be customers who want to do it. I think the crackle might be back. Karen, when you, I think someone's listening to you in another room, somewhere else in the world, but that's online summit for you. Karen, when you're talking to potential sponsors, partners and sponsors, are they receptive to the idea or about selling social purpose within what they're going to ultimately do in a TV ad or something, if they're going to work with Lewes Football Club or whatever it is, or do they still basically want to sell soap powder? They want to sell units or whatever they're selling. How do you find that?
Okay, so to be really honest, I think that there are quite a few companies that just want to shift products in the short term, and those companies is possibly not the right association, women's football, for them. Because although we have reach, we don't have the massive reach that men's football has yet. However, for companies who have a vision and want to establish a kind of long-term partnerships where they can align themselves with a powerful narrative, women's football is your woman, because as opposed to your man, you see, because they can harness these incredible stories that our women footballers have, and they can basically, women's football is about unstereotyping. So the minute a woman kicks a football, she is going against the grain. Whereas if a man kicks a football, he's actually reinforcing the stereotypes that we already have. So if we're talking about freeing people up, social purpose, freeing people up to really be themselves, to be authentic versions of themselves, then women's football is a really useful tool to associate with as a product, because, well, really for the reasons I've just said. And all I can say is that when I go and tell women who have been frustrated now for some years about #MeToo, #Time's Up, and want to take some kind of action against this stuff, they're looking to, if you like, you said soap and hope, they're looking for hope with their soap. Yeah? They're looking that the money they spend has an effect on their environment, as well as just getting the product, whatever it is they want to.
This is what I'm wondering, and Gill, and definitely pertinent to what I've read in your book. Do you think sponsorships can help to create female role models, or indeed male allies, or does that work really have to be done internally by companies and at societal level? Am I just hoping for too much at that point? That was a question that's by Gill. I don't know, Jill, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can't hear the question for it, but I know it's about selling hope versus selling soap from what you just said. So, I mean, I honestly think it has to be about this. When you approach brands, I think it has to be about selling hope versus selling soap, because by definition, when women play football, what is amazing about women playing football? There are many amazing things about women playing football, but one of them is they're not being decorative, and it's absolutely about performance, not prettiness, right? This is women in performance mode, not pretty mode, which is so important because we are bombarded with seeing women in pretty mode from the moment we're born. We see them being pretty and we see them in the kitchen and we hardly ever see them doing anything else. So seeing them performing, not pretty, so important. So it's extremely difficult then as a brand. And, you know, I've worked on shampoo brands, I've worked on makeup brands, I've worked on skincare brands. Extremely difficult to then congruently say, well, that's what's special about women in football. But now we're going to talk about how fabulous her hair looks with this shampoo. You know, it undermines the whole, what is special about this. So I think that really the brands that should be interested in this should be interested in it to sell hope and to sell a purpose and to attach themselves to what this means and what this says about women and what this says about society. They need to attach themselves to the mission, not to, and then after the game, you know, she look beautiful. It undermines the football, it undermines the women, and it undermines the brand if they do that. The only exception I could think of is performance. You know, I mean, I've obviously, one of the brands I've worked on, the Always and Tampax skincare brands, extremely important performance brands, extremely important, obviously, you know, for women when they're, you know, in that moment, they really need performance. So I think there's some product sales that could work, but largely I think it is about selling the purpose. The one thing I would say though is if a brand's going to do this, they have to do it authentically, and it has to be authentic for the brand and for the company. It's got to fit, you know, with the other things they're doing. If behind the scenes that brand or that company behind that brand is not committed to women and to gender equality, in this world, consumers are going to sniff that out very, very quickly. So I think it has to be very congruent for the brand. But if it is, that's absolutely, you know, where I would go. That absolutely is where I'd be targeting, is brands, you know, who want to be associated with that extremely strong message about.
Yeah. I mean, we wouldn't, as you say, we wouldn't want any brand to be put up as, you know, and not possibly feel they more, because I'm sure that's true of all the companies and brands who could be doing more. And I think we've certainly seen, and I think this was mentioned in the seminar yesterday, when Budweiser, I think it was, got involved in the recent tournament in the States, and there was a drive-through of the fans. They could meet the teams afterwards, and people had gone and bought Budweiser beer for the teams to show their appreciation, because Budweiser was a tournament sponsor. Now, to me, I wouldn't automatically think of Budweiser as being like right up there as gender equality. They might be. It's not a product association. But what I think it also showed was that when brands do get involved in a women's game, they can rally really significant loyalty and love from fans in a way they probably couldn't from the men's game. I mean, Katie, coming to you, because you uniquely market across men's and women's teams, are you finding it that activations from sponsors activate differently in the men's and women's teams, or is a lot of it still quite similar at the moment? Are people learning still?
Well, it's funny you mentioned Budweiser, because our Houston Dash are the 2020 champions of the Challenge Cup, which was the bubble in Utah due to COVID. And Budweiser was a sponsor. Yeah. And a lot of our ladies were taken on video and photography celebrating after their championship victory with Budweiser. And Budweiser was fired up. And so they proceeded. Due to COVID, we couldn't have what we traditionally have in the States, those championship parades in the downtown metro area of the city. And so we instead had a drive-by parade where folks could drive by in their personal vehicles, and we had all the ladies and the coaching staff on a stage. Well, wouldn't you know, fans upon fans were dropping off cases of Budweiser. Budweiser, in addition, had all this additional product delivered during the drive-through. So it was a real fun activation for Budweiser, but it was also where the general fans of the Houston Dash and the NWSL, and frankly, general sports fans in Houston, which is a demographic we're really trying to chase, because Houston is such a sports motivated city, but traditionally has not sponsored the Dash or supported them to the extent of obviously some of the other teams. And it was just a really fun opportunity to see how all those things were culminating together. But in general terms, I would say activation from the sponsors is fairly similar at this point.
Okay.
With some exceptions, obviously, for specific product lines like jewelry, for example, is handled a little differently because, you know, men tend to not wear jewelry such as ladies. But in general, I would say I haven't seen too much of a distinction on approach that sponsors are taking as far as their activation. In their advertising, it is a little more, you can see a difference a little more. It's a little more emotional. It evokes those feelings within you. And I think that's what the corporate world is trying to kind of go after. But that's more of a traditional advertising outlet for them, but not in live in-game or event aspect. I mean,
that's interesting. And the Budweiser story is fascinating. And I guess it's an open question. We've got about 5 minutes left of the session now, I think. But I'm just wondering, and maybe and I love men's and women's football. I've become a huge, huge follower of women's football, not just because of my own association as a director, but just generally enjoy watching it as a sport. But I'm wondering, having met now so many of like the footballers who play at Lewes, for example, and, you know, knowing the struggles and what it takes to run and be a women's football team and a football club, loaded question, but do you think there's actually a stronger set of stories for brands to associate with? Because as we know, you know, finding stories and amplifying those stories is a huge thing for brands. Do you think there's a strong argument that says there are just far more stories in women's football than men's football? Gill, I don't know, did you hear that one?
Yeah, I'm nodding vigorously because I absolutely do think, you know, it's a strong story. No disrespect to men's football, I adore men's football, but you know, the story of men's football, it is quite an obvious story. You know, masculine man plays football. There's nothing really unexpected about that, and it's very difficult for a brand to do something distinctive with that. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's difficult. But when you start talking about women playing football, which is still, you know, it's not something that we're used to seeing in the everyday. We're used to thinking about, as we say, they're not being decorative for once. They're performing not pretty. That's something that starts to get a little bit unexpected, a little bit unpredictable. And that starts to get your heart going. And that's what brands love. That's what great brand builders love. Is they love something that has a twist, that they can play with, they can connect with the heart. Brands need to make a connection with human beings, and they make connections by you know, connecting on things that are not obvious, that people say, oh yes, that's true, but it wasn't obvious to me before. So I think I do genuinely believe that there is a possibility here for brands to do much more creative and insightful and connecting things with women's football than they can actually do with men's football. And by the way, you know, how many years of brand work with men's football have we done? I mean, you know, a lot of the ideas have been exhausted. I do think it is a greater opportunity for brands, and they really should absolutely get on it. But I think, you know, to be smart, you know, the more that you can actually hold brands, it won't necessarily be obvious to them. So it won't necessarily be a case of just put it out there and they'll get it. You know, a little bit of a, you know, actually target them and actually help them to think about the kind of slightly different story that they can tell that they might not have thought of. I think that will pay dividends.
And Katie, just to sort of just follow up on that with the last few minutes, but in terms of in your unique position, and you can, I'm sure you know now a whole number of the players in the men's team and the women's team as well. Is it a fair statement to say that, with all due respect, and I, you know, it's okay, it's just between the four of us, that the women's football team has a different array and more interesting stories than the men? I'm sure the men are great, but how they got there, what they have to do, etc. Or maybe that's not the case with you. I don't know.
You know, I don't know if it's a men's women's thing. At least in my experience here between the Dynamo and Dash, it's more individual stories. And yeah, I mean, there have been some interesting and unique stories on both sides of the camp. I think the one item of differentiation is the women do have additional hurdles, their salaries, their opportunities and the like. So sometimes those lend to stories, but I wouldn't lump them in saying just generically the women's stories are more interesting, more detailed. I really think because we have so many international players on the men's side that, you know, some of the places they grew up or their access to training was non-existent. So I think that we have a unique situation where we have, you know, great stories on both sides of the house, as they say.
That's a cracking answer. Absolutely. So good stories around, I'm sure, but very, very good stories as well in women's football. We come to now towards the end of the session, and it's good to reintroduce the crackle of the mouse running across the keyboard again, in case you were missing that. I certainly did miss that for the last 10 minutes. So hopefully you've enjoyed the session, watching it with all five of us, with myself, Charlie, Dobres, Karen, Katie, Gill, and the 30 Mike in the level. But thank you very much for joining. I think there are, yes, you're allowed to wave in Brady Bunch fashion as well. But thanks for joining, everybody. I know the recordings of these sessions will sit online, and maybe it can be decrackled, I'm not sure. But more sessions follow tomorrow. But for the time being, from Lewes, from Geneva, and from Houston, it's goodbye from all of us. Thank you.
Cheers.